made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it. This quote comes from Red Cloud, the leader of the Lakota Nation and the only nation to defeat the United States on American soil. It embodies many of the tense, violent, and oppressive relations between Native American groups and the U.S. government. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County in the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you wherever you are listening. Last episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we followed the early life of Shoshone leader Washakie from his birth in the early 1800s and through the early 1850s when he became the leader of his people. Gifted with foresight, or at least an understanding of what his people were up against with the flood of white Americans into the West, Washakie had chosen to become allies with the United States government. Due to his close friendship with famed trapper and scout Jim Bridger, he did his best to keep the peace between his people and the ever-growing number of settlers in the Central Rockies. Eventually, the numbers of immigrants and settlers moving across and into Shoshone territory forced matters to a head. By 1862, some Shoshone warriors were leading periodic raids on immigrant trains and settlements. Spurred into action, U.S. officials sought to set aside lands for the Shoshones and the closely related tribe, the Bannocks, and at the same time, protect the overland immigrant routes. Before much was accomplished, however, Colonel Patrick Connor led a large-scale militia attack on a Shoshone winter camp near the Bear River, massacring over 240 Indians. Washakie was not involved, although one of his warriors and the band leader, Norcock, supposedly fought in the battle. Although the Shoshones and Bannocks continued sporadic fighting for several months thereafter, the end result forced a treaty with the United States. This event, known as the Treaty of Fort Bridger in 1863, set aside over 45 million acres of Shoshone country, stretching from the Wind River Mountains south and west, and including parts of what were to become Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Washakie was one of the two principal signers, with 9 other men fixing their marks to the document. At least 2, Norcock and Basile, were leaders whose bands were often associated with Washakie. This was the beginning of the Wind River Reservation and the second half of Washakie's incredible life. Many people think the American Indian Reservation system was a result of the Bloody Plains Indians Wars after the American Civil War. In reality, whites creating reservations for Native Americans on the continent began nearly 100 years earlier in the southwest of the original 13 states. Conflict between white settlers and Native American peoples on the East Coast had raged since the first contact between the two. Wars were fought over land and resources, with the Native American people continually being driven back. In a bid to stop the constant battles, the U.S. government came up with the idea of the American Indian Reservation System, which established tracts of land called reservations for Native Americans to live on as white settlers took over their land. The main goals of Indian reservations were to bring Native Americans under U.S. government control, minimize conflicts between Indians and settlers, and encourage Native Americans to take on the ways of the white man. As a result, many Native Americans were forced onto reservations with catastrophic results and devastating, long-lasting effects. The history of the early reservation system and broken treaties and promises that were part of it is part of a long and complicated story. What follows is a brief summary to set the stage for the reservations to come, including the Wind River Reservation. In 1785, the Treaty of Hopewell was signed in Georgia, the largest state at the time, placing the native Cherokees under the protection of a young United States and setting boundaries for their land. But it wasn't long before European settlers intruded on Cherokee land. The Cherokees fought back against the white settlements. To reestablish peace between the Cherokees and the settlers, the Treaty of Holston was signed in 1791, in which the Cherokees agreed to give all of their land outside of their established borders. Not only did the federal government want Native Americans to give up their land, they also encouraged them to become farmers and Christians. In the 19th century, settlers moved into southern Cherokee territory en masse and wanted their government representatives to claim the land. The United States acted to remove all Indian nations from the southeast. Georgia agreed to cede her western land to the government in return for Indian land title. After the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson hoped to move eastern Indian tribes past the Mississippi River, but most Indians rejected his idea. When Georgia held lotteries to allocate seized Indian land, the battle-weary Creeks, who'd sought sanctuary in East Alabama, fought for their independence against the militia of Andrew Jackson. After suffering a devastating defeat at what became known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the Creeks yielded more than 20 million acres of land to the federal government. Over the next several years, the government passed several acts to diminish Indian autonomy, despite the Cherokee forming a new constitution-based government of their own. And in December of 1828, Georgia ordered the seizure of the remaining Cherokee land in their state. On May 28, 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed by President Jackson. The act allowed the government to divide land west of the Mississippi to give the Indian tribes in exchange for the land they lost. The government would pick up the cost of relocating the Indians and helping them resettle. The Indian Removal Act was controversial, but Jackson argued it was the best option since settlers had rendered Indian lands incompatible with sustaining their way of life. As white settlers continued westward and needed more land, Indian territory shrank, but there was no more land for the government to move them to. In 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which created the Indian reservation system and provided funds to move Indian tribes onto farming reservations and hopefully keep them under control in what is now Oklahoma. Native Americans were again forced to move even smaller parcels of land, now called reservations. The U.S. government had promised to support the relocated tribal members with food and other supplies, but their commitments often went unfulfilled. Native Americans' ability to hunt, fish, and gather food was severely restricted. Illness, starvation, and depression remained a constant for many. Throughout this time, the federal government's policies towards Native Americans and the sentiments of white Americans in general included a varying combination of paternalism, racism, and greed. It is in this setting that Washakie, who must have known about the government's policy of creating reservations, set out to try and find a home for his people on his own terms. He also had to be aware, from his personal experiences and the experiences of other tribes in the region, of the government's habit of breaking almost every treaty with Native American people that they created. It put him in a difficult position, but Washakie wasn't a man who ran from a challenge, and he had little choice. He could either work with the white government and the people to get the best deal he could, or be given no choice in the matter, like all the tribes around him. The 1863 agreement achieved peace between Shoshones and whites, but had significant other problems. For one, settlers and immigrants now had free access to traditional Shoshone hunting grounds in the Fort Bridger, Bear River, and Salt Lake region, and were spreading northward up the Green River Valley. Washakie had preferred his people be able to stay on the western side of the mountains and hunt as they had in the Green River Basin, but he and other Shoshone leaders increasingly turned to hunt in Crow territory of the Wind River Basin on the eastern side of the Wind River Range, or even onto the plains east of Powder River and the Big Horn Mountains in Wyoming. This area had also been part of the Shoshones' historical range, but by pushing into the Wind River area, the Shoshones were vulnerable to attacks by Crow, Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapahoes, who all vied for the same hunting territories. A new round of peace negotiations with Indian peoples began in 1867 and continued into 1868. Washakie took advantage of this new situation, and upon learning that the Crows had relinquished their claims to Wind River with their new treaty, gladly signed a new Fort Bridger Treaty in 1868 that created the Shoshone and Bannock Indian Agency in the Wind River Valley. He was trading over 40 million acres of land for a much smaller area, but one he hoped wouldn't be attractive to white settlers who were already filling in the boundaries of the 1863 reservation. Part of the idea for putting the Shoshone in the Wind River country was the lack of white presence there. No major trails ran in the basin, and few whites were looking to settle there. The reservation originally stretched from South Pass at the southern end of the Wind River Range, north and northeast all the way past the Owl Creek Mountains and into the Hot Springs region along the Big Horn River, an area of nearly 3 million acres. Creating a reservation on paper, however, did not yield immediate benefits. For 3 more years, Shoshones received their treaty annuities at Fort Bridger. Moreover, Oglala Lakota warriors under Red Cloud raided both white and Shoshone towns and camps in the Wind River, such that it was too dangerous to move there on any kind of permanent basis. Part of Washakie's negotiations with the government on this new treaty was the demand that the U.S. Army establish a fort to protect his people. They were moving into a hotly contested area where the Shoshones' traditional enemies, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, were still a major presence. The Army agreed, and in 1869, Camp Auger, a subpost of the much larger Fort Bridger in the southwest corner of Wyoming Territory, was established. Not long after, it was renamed Camp Brown. This post, a small detachment at first, was in the valley of the Middle Fork of the Poposia River. In a few years, this area became the Lander Valley in the town of Lander. Ironically, this U.S. Army post was there to protect the Shoshones from their enemies, not white settlers from the Native Americans. While the Shoshone hunted in the South Pass region, they mostly set up their camps along the Little Wind River, about 15 miles north of Camp Brown. This distance didn't really help protect the Shoshone, given that it would take a full day just to travel from Camp Brown to the Little Wind River, where most of the Shoshones and the Indian Agency were located. In 1871, Camp Brown was relocated to the banks of the Little Wind River and became a full military fort. A few years later, it would be named Fort Washakie, the only U.S. Army post to be named for a Native American leader. The lack of white settlers in the Wind River area changed dramatically in 1869 with the discovery of gold in the Sweetwater mining district in the South Pass region. Almost overnight, thousands of miners and businessmen flooded the area. The towns of South Pass City, Atlantic City, and Hamilton City sprang up almost overnight, and ranchers and farmers seeking land to grow food to feed the mining camps spread down into the valleys along the rivers. Washakie saw the writing on the wall with the influx of gold seekers. He had bitter first-hand experience in trying to keep whites out of Indian country if there was something there they wanted, so in 1871 he agreed to relinquish all land south of the North Fork of the Poposia River. The official agreement, called the Brunot Secession, wasn't ratified by Congress until 1874. This included the valley where Camp Auger, or Camp Brown, had been, and the entire mining district, including South Pass. For giving up the land, the Shoshone were to receive $5,000 worth of cattle for 5 years, and Washakie was to receive an annuity of $500 for 5 years. This was the first of several changes to the boundaries of the Wind River Reservation. For the next 30 years, Washakie walked a delicate tightrope of trying to adhere to the new demands that he and his people were to become civilized, while also at the same time maintaining traditional Shoshonean ways. Throughout the 1870s, for example, he allowed his children to attend the first of many different agency schools, but still took them on fall buffalo hunts into the Bighorn River drainage. He moved from living in a high teepee to a log house, but still led warriors into battle against the Sioux and Cheyenne in U.S. Army campaigns in 1876. He insisted that white officials abide by Shoshone Council decisions regarding distributions of food, annuities, and other supplies. Thus, he maintained his role as chief spokesperson for the tribe as a whole, but also respected the leadership of the various Shoshone bands who lived on the reservation. He repeatedly refused to allow an Indian police force, who often served as the eyes and ears of white officials, to be created in the late 1870s and early 1880s, strongly suggesting that the Shoshones could police themselves and provide good order. He farmed a small plot of land as an example to other Shoshones, but also made sure that white farmers and stock growers in the lands adjacent to the reservation pay for the use of reservation lands in either gifts of livestock or in grazing fees. But changes to the countryside already were falling into place that would limit Washakie's and the Shoshones' choices about living life in the traditional way. While the gold boom went bust in the mining district, the town of Lander grew rapidly. In order to gain more settlement and population to eventually become a state rather than a territory, Lander boosters, as well as those in other areas of Wyoming, did all they could to promote the white development of these, quote, unoccupied lands of Wyoming Territory, including the lands that surrounded the reservation. In the mid-1880s, Washakie's influence on reservation policies and life waned even further. In part, this came about because of two drastic changes. First, the northern Arapahoes, longtime enemies of the Shoshones, were moved to the reservation in 1878. The Arapaho were another tribe that originated in the northeast and were gradually pushed west by white expansion. They were in the Dakotas in the late 1700s, but were pushed south to the Platte and Arkansas rivers by the aggressive and growing Lakota tribe who concentrated in the northern plains. The Arapaho also experienced being promised land only to have the treaty ignored. In September 1851, about 10,000 Indians gathered near Fort Laramie to negotiate. Under the treaty signed that month, the tribes of the northern plains would allow the United States to establish army posts and make roads through Indian territory. They also agreed to the government's proposal to assign specific lands to specific tribes. Tribes were allowed to live and hunt where they liked, on their lands or others, as long as they remained peaceful. Lands north of the Arkansas River, east of the Continental Divide, and south of the North Platte River were assigned jointly to the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. This included most of what is now eastern Colorado, plus large parts of southeastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, and western Kansas. In return, the government promised the tribes annual payments of $50,000 in goods for 50 years. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty in 1852. But the government seemed not to be taking the treaty seriously. War broke out between the Army and the Lakota just 3 years later. In 1858, prospectors found gold near what is now Denver, right in the middle of the lands allocated to the Arapaho and Cheyenne by the Fort Laramie Treaty. Within 3 years, 100,000 or more gold seekers and other whites poured into what soon became the Colorado Territory. Along the trails, conflict grew and intensified. This influx of newcomers widened the old geographical divisions between northern and southern bands of Arapaho and Cheyenne people. Northern bands moved from the Colorado Front Range to the plains north of the North Platte River. Others stayed south toward the Arkansas. Allied with the Cheyenne, the Arapaho fought for their hunting rights and territory against the ever-growing numbers of white settlers. After the Colorado Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where a band of Arapaho and Cheyenne were slaughtered by a white militia, the Cheyenne and Arapaho joined the Lakota in open warfare against the white settlers, and battles raged across Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming. While the southern Arapaho portion of the tribe accepted a small reservation in Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory, the northern Arapaho continued to hunt and fight for the Powder River Basin of Wyoming. They roamed westward into the White River Basin as far as South Pass, where they came into conflict with the Shoshone and Washakie. As more and more Plains tribes eventually surrendered and moved to reservations, the northern Arapaho resisted government attempts to place them somewhere other than their current chosen hunting grounds. They wanted either to have a reservation in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming Territory or in southern Colorado, neither of which were going to happen. Matters came to a head in 1874 at a major conflict between the northern Arapaho and U.S. soldiers from Camp Brown and Shoshone scouts allied with them. The Bates Battle, as it came to be known, was on No Wood Creek, north of today's Lost Cabin. The Arapaho lost most of their horses and lodges, and it was the last time the Arapaho would fight the whites. The next few years were a time of intense hardship for the Arapaho. They subsisted as best they could, while their leaders Black Cole and Sharpnose made new efforts to obtain a suitable reservation. Finally, in 1877, a delegation of Arapaho leaders and U.S. Army officers met with the U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes. This meeting led to an agreement that the government would negotiate with Washakie to place the Arapaho on the Wind River Reservation. Washakie and his people were not happy about this proposal, but Washakie recognized that the Arapaho were destitute, nearly starving, and many wouldn't survive the coming winter. So he reluctantly agreed to let the Arapaho spend just that winter on the Wind River Reservation until a home could be found for them. Although this was supposed to be a temporary placement, the Arapahos became equal shareholders in the resources of the reservation. Thus, Washakie's ability to shape council decisions and limit the impact of official decisions made by the government was curtailed severely. A more telling blow was the elimination of buffalo hunting as the mainstay of the Shoshone economy. As long as Washakie and the Shoshones could depend on buffalo as their main source of food and economic activity, they could parry the attempts of the Indian agents to make them become farmers. The last buffalo were killed in 1885. The Wyoming livestock industry expanded into Wind River country, severely limiting off-reservation hunting activities to other big game such as elk. This forced the majority of Shoshones, including Washakie, to pay more attention to the issues of farming, ranching, and wage labor. These changes, along with Washakie's increasing age, eroded his power, but did not end it entirely. For example, in the mid-1880s, Wind River Indian agents eventually signed on Shoshones to the tribal police service, but Washakie named the men to these positions. In fact, he often nominated the Shoshone Indian employees for agency positions as teamsters, farmers, herders, and other roles. Washakie's last major act took place in the 1869 Hot Springs land secession, when the Shoshone and Arapaho acceded to the demands of the government to sell a 10-square-mile parcel of land at the northeastern corner of the reservation. This parcel of land contained a natural hot springs found in the present-day town of Thermopolis. As one of the conditions of the sale, Washakie insisted that the springs remain open to all people, a condition that is still honored today. Although he had accepted baptism as a Mormon in 1880, when missionary Amos Wright spent several weeks proselytizing among the Shoshones, Washakie agreed to another baptism in 1897 at the hands of the reservation's Episcopal missionary John Roberts. Roberts had come to the reservation in 1883 and had courted Washakie's favor over the ensuing years, eventually becoming fast friends with the old man. This second baptism achieved the same desired result as had the first. Washakie recovered from a serious illness, but his renewed good health lasted for little more than 2 years. He again became quite ill in the late winter of 1899 and finally succumbed on February 20th, 1900. Buried with full military honors and as a commissioned captain in the U.S. Army, and with a funeral train that stretched for miles, Washakie's death was a symbol, as had been his life, of the effort made to bring peace to disparate groups, to listen to new ideas, and to adapt new technologies, and still honor the traditions of a proud people. His loss was deeply felt among the Shoshones, and given the changes wrought by reservation life, no other leader ever emerged among the Shoshones who achieved his stature. Over one-half of the adult males expressed this loss a few months after his death in a letter written to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Reads, quote, "Our great father, we, your children the Shoshones, would be pleased if you would appoint someone of our number to be chief, or in some way give us a head. As you must know, that our old Chief Washakie is dead, and we are now left without a head to look to. It is now with us like a man with many tongues, all talking at once, and every one of his tongues pulling every which way. We are feeling bad that things should be in such shape among us. So we leave it to you to say who shall be our chief, or you name any number, say 9 or 11, but we want you to say, and we will abide by what you say." End quote. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Our next episode will be on the South Pass City Gold Rush, briefly mentioned in this episode. If you want to help keep this podcast up and running, please consider donating to the Wind River Cultural Center's foundation. Visit their website, www.windriverccf.com, for more information. To learn more about our museums or to get in contact with us, visit our website, fremontcountymuseums.com. Thank you for listening to the Rediscover the Winds podcast. I hope you learned something new and have a great rest of your day.